Good morning and welcome. I'm Bill Lake, the Chief of the Media Bureau, and want to welcome you all here, also to our live webcast audience. We are webcasting each of these sessions today and on the previous days, and the proceedings will be made part of the record in our media ownership proceeding. For those who weren't with us yesterday and the previous day, I just want to say that these sessions are an experiment in process, and we welcome comments on this process itself. We are starting early the 2010 quadrennial review of our media ownership rules, and we wanted to start them by asking for input on the questions of how we frame the inquiry so that we can be sure that we go into it as intelligently as possible in order to produce the best result at the other end. The purpose of these sessions is not so much to get views as to where we should come out, but as to how we should go in, how we should frame the questions, what kinds of facts we should be looking at in order to help answer the questions. And we've had two very good sessions so far. We heard first from a group of policy scholars on Monday, and yesterday from a group of public interest representatives. And today we get to hear from some of the industry stakeholders as to their views as to how we should shape the inquiry. We will not have an opportunity at these sessions for questions or comments from the audience. We do look forward to having a number of future workshops and hearings both in Washington and elsewhere at which we will have an open mic, and we will look forward to hearing directly from members of the public. We have invited anyone who has views on the issues we're discussing today to submit written views to the Commission by November 20th, and those views, of course, as well will help us to frame our notice in this proceeding. The purpose of these sessions is to help us, to give us the most guidance we can get on how to frame the notice that we will issue to begin the more formal stage of the proceedings. Commissioner Copps has asked me to mention that he has been with us for the first two sessions. He would be here today, except that he had a conflicting engagement, and he hopes to join us when we're partway through the proceedings. We will begin with a short statement by each of the honored guests that we have today, and then we'll take a short break at about 10:15 or 10:30, and we'll resume after a short break with a panel discussion. And with that, I'll just ask each of the speakers to stay fairly near the microphone because we are recording these proceedings. And we'll start with David Barrett, President and CEO of Hearst Television, Inc.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to participate in the Commission's first ownership review since the nation's historic transition to digital television. Digital technology has enabled local TV stations, large and small, to expand and improve the quality and diversity of their free, over-the-air, wireless, if you will, video services. Our ability to provide multiple channels of video programming has expanded the number of media voices in every local market. And for that reason, my remarks will focus on the state of television competition in local markets and the need for reassessment of the Commission's current local television ownership rules. The digital era has begun, and the Commission, of course, must look forward, not backward, as it fashions a regulatory framework to promote and foster local video competition. The competitive framework for local TV is vastly different today than it was 10 years ago. Indeed, each time the Commission conducts a new media ownership proceeding, it's confronted with a broad array of new media platforms for the delivery of information and entertainment. For example, in 2000, satellite television was becoming a new competitor, rapidly expanding the delivery of satellite program networks and broadcast station delivery into local markets. In 2002, the Internet was emerging as a new provider of information and entertainment, and ultimately exploded into a multimedia platform, giving rise to YouTube and literally thousands of websites and blogs that provide information and commentary. In 2006, telephone companies were investing billions of dollars to launch their own video programming services over fiber optic networks. Today, cellular telephones and new mobile devices are allowing consumers to access information and entertainment anytime from virtually anywhere in the world. So what was formerly the prospect of new competition is now an undisputed fact for local TV stations, and it's manifested each day as we compete for viewers and advertising revenues. Take Sunday, October 25th of this year, for example. YouTube streamed a live U2 concert from the Rose Bowl during prime time. YouTube estimates that the concert generated as many as 10 million individual streams worldwide. That's a reality of primetime video competition on a new digital platform that did not even exist several years ago. The new video competition poses both new competitive and financial challenges to local television stations. Advertising revenue for local television stations in the second quarter of 2009 dropped more than 26% from the same quarter a year ago. And advertising revenues, of course, are our economic lifeblood. The competition from new video distribution platforms fragments our viewing and our revenues. And as the Commission is aware, a number of local broadcast companies and stations are in bankruptcy, some are in reorganization, and that number is unprecedented. It's increasingly difficult for local stations to finance the cost of local news, weather, local emergency information, local election coverage, local public affairs, and programming devoted to political discourse, the very kind of programming the nation has come to expect from local broadcast stations, and the kind of programming that is not provided by the new video platforms, and certainly not provided on a universally free over-the-air basis. The new competition, coupled with the challenging economy, have forced local stations to eliminate jobs in some cases and to undertake restructuring initiatives that may adversely impact local service. All these challenges call for a fresh look at the Commission's local television station ownership rules, and I urge the Commission to reassess these ownership regulations. The new competitive and financial realities of the expanding video distribution system cannot be ignored. By consolidating ownership, operational, and technological resources, local TV stations can achieve new economic efficiencies and would be able to compete more effectively in the digital era. I understand, however, that public policy and regulatory tension in this respect, and the Commission should, of course, be concerned with undue concentration of media ownership at the local level. But the Commission should be equally concerned with promoting and fostering video competition at the local level and with preserving the local dynamic that characterizes the American system of broadcasting. Every local television station manager is asking the same question. How can we realistically compete with the hundreds of cable and satellite channels supported by advertising and subscriber revenues, and which have little, if any, public service programming requirements, while at the same time we provide extensive local news, local weather, local election coverage, local emergency alerts, and the like? It's a fair question. To be effective, local stations must be able to achieve greater economic efficiencies. The Commission can facilitate these efficiencies by adopting a different standard where appropriate for common ownership and operation of multiple stations. In connection with this proceeding 8 years ago, our company conducted a survey that identified an average of 39 separately owned media voices in the nation's 210 media markets, including an average of 20 separately owned media voices in smaller TV markets in the ranking of 150 to 200. That estimate did not include Internet news services, multicast channels, satellite radio service, or low-power radio stations. That was 2001. Clearly, the number of separately owned media voices in local markets is appreciably greater today. In 2003, our company proposed a new local television ownership metric as a method for determining undue concentration of media ownership. Our proposal would replace the existing local ownership rules voice count and top 4 restrictions with a two-part analysis grounded in principles of antitrust law. Rather than focus on market revenue for purposes of local station ownership metric, the focus in our proposal was on market audience share. The proposal would be subject, of course, to customary antitrust review, but it would presumptively permit common ownership of local television stations if, 1, the combination's collective share of the viewing audience is 30% or less, and secondly, the resulting concentration of audience share of local TV stations, together with the increase in concentration of such audience share, satisfied a standard based on the General Numerical Antitrust Standard in the Department of Justice and FTC's horizontal merger guidelines, and this is referred to as the HHI Index. This general approach has several advantages. First, and importantly, it measures audience across broadcast, cable, and DBS video platforms. Second, it provides a reasonable measure of stability because small changes in audience share will not affect the metric. And third, the proposal is equally applicable in large markets and small markets. And fourth, the proposal provides bright line tests, allowing the Commission to evaluate proposed combinations more quickly and efficiently. The proposal would not lead, I believe, to a wave of local media mergers leading to unacceptable market concentration. In fact, economic experts that the Commission itself relied upon in the 2002 media ownership proceeding commented that the bright line test in our proposal was stricter than FTC enforcement and only a small step away from the Commission's own rules. We respectfully urge the Commission to revisit that proposal, and our lawyers, you all are acquainted with Mr. Hargrove, would be happy to review the proposal in detail with you and your staff at the appropriate time. We view this as a unique opportunity to bring its local television ownership policies in line with the competitive video and economic realities of our industry, and I hope that the Commission uses this proceeding to usher in new, more flexible, and more competitive local policies for the digital era. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I look forward to our dialogue.
Thank you very much, David. We'll hear next from Jessica Gonzalez, Policy Counsel for the National Hispanic Media Coalition.
Thank you. The National Hispanic Media Coalition is a little unique on this panel, so I'm going to briefly share with you about who we are. We're a 23-year-old nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the portrayal of American Latinos as portrayed by the media, to increase Latino employment in all facets of the media industry, and to advocate for telecommunications and media policies that benefit the Latino community and other communities of color. We thank you for inviting us here today to provide our perspective on how the process should should go forward for the 2010 Quadrennial Review. We applaud the Commission for opening this proceeding in such an open and transparent way. These hearings and the initial process-focused inquiry are essential to fixing a process that is currently broken, and we see this as a great first step towards a thorough and fact-driven review, one that properly considers how the current structural media ownership regulations and any proposed changes thereto might impact communities of color, both in terms of minority ownership as well as in terms of access to diverse viewpoints. This must be addressed in this proceeding, especially now, as only 7% of broadcast radio stations are owned by people of color, despite that we make up 33% of the population. And as Latinos own just 2.9% of radio stations, despite that we comprise 15% of the population. So I'd like to explain what I mean when I refer to this as a broken process. And please forgive me, but I'm going to just go back in history very briefly to explain. In the 2002 Quadrennial Review, the Commission expansively deregulated without explaining how that deregulation would impact minority and female ownership. The Third Circuit reversed and remanded that decision, in part because it found it arbitrary and capricious that the FCC had failed to explain the impact of deregulation on minority and female ownership. The FCC then folded the 2002 remand into the 2006 review. Meanwhile, it did not act on waiver and license renewal requests, thus allowing license renewal applications to remain outstanding for years. In fact, NHMC spent our own scarce resources to file a petition to deny a license over 3 years ago, and that petition remains outstanding today. Unfortunately, the current Commission has inherited this backlog and now has to decide what to do about it. The Commission's 2007 order again failed to adequately consider how the rule change would impact minority and female ownership. Instead, it opened a separate docket to address diversity issues. We've seen some progress in that docket, but not the kind of analysis that I think was contemplated by the court. And here we are now on the verge of the 2010 review. Meanwhile, neither the 2002 nor the 2006 proceedings have truly come to a close. In addition, countless cross-ownerships have been permitted to endure long past the expiration of their licenses. We are pleased that Chairman Janikowski has acted so expediently to dive into this issue and ensure that it is resolved as quickly as possible. This procedural nightmare, we know, was not created by any one person or decision, and so we're really not here to place blame, but rather to encourage the FCC to seize this opportunity to make some concrete alterations to make the quadrennial review process less dysfunctional. And I use the term less dysfunctional very deliberately here because I earnestly believe that the Section 202H mandate requiring quadrennial reviews is unworkable and in need of repeal. In any event, I provide the following 3 recommendations to help clean this process up a bit. First, I recommend that any modification of structural media ownership regulations must be examined not only for its impact on diversity and competition, but also for how it will affect minority and female ownership. To fail to consider this factor would harm the public interest and be a disservice to current and potential minority and female broadcasters and the viewers and the listeners that they serve. I want to be careful to explain what I mean by this. I do not suggest that we merge this proceeding with the diversity proceeding. The Commission's made some progress in that docket, especially as of late, and it should be permitted to advance without being bogged down in the quadrennial review process. We must, however, look at how the structural media ownership regulations impact diversity of viewpoints and ownership in this proceeding as well. So my second recommendation is, before being able to consider the impact of these regulations on minority and females, the FCC has to collect the data. And you've already adopted some mechanisms to aid in this process, including a rule that requires broadcasters, including sole proprietors, to report ownership data every 2 years. You should implement this rule swiftly so that when it comes time to make substantive decisions, you have the data to base them on. You should also consider the excellent data collection proposals made by Professor Catherine Sandoval and the public interest groups that are jointly represented by Georgetown Law's Institute for Public Representation, and those have been made in the diversity docket. Last time around, Free Press did a tremendous amount of work to compile data on minority and female ownership. But this burden should not fall on the public alone. In addition, the FCC must base decisions on data that is open and accessible to the public, not proprietary data that is either unavailable or accessible only for a cost. To do so really frustrates public participation in this process. A few questions I'd like to see asked. Do minority owners have more diverse programming? Do they do a better job of catering to community needs? What factors influence programming decisions? The third recommendation is that the Commission must resolve waiver and license renewal applications and any associated petitions to deny expediently upon their filing, or at the very least upon expiration of the license. I know this sounds like it's easier said than done, but licensees should not be allowed to operate indefinitely pending quadrennial review, because as we all know, this proceeding's been essentially ongoing since 2002, and so to allow these waivers or these licensees to continue operating is essentially an in-run around the rules. I fear that it also may incentivize some to buy up multiple properties in violation of the rules and hope that they can convince the Commission to relax the rules in the next quadrennial review. So I think the practical way to proceed is to apply the rule in place at the time of the license's expiration. And this would also provide the certainty that I think that broadcasters would like to see in this proceeding. Thank you.
Very much. Our next presenter will be Jane Mago, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the National Association of Broadcasters.
Thank you. Good morning, and thanks again for allowing me to participate in this workshop on media ownership. I am happy to be an honored guest here this morning and represent the views of free local radio and television broadcast stations throughout the country. In my opening remarks here today, I hope to make three main points. First, as the FCC examines the broadcast ownership rules, it should recognize that permitting broadcasters to compete effectively in the digital multi-channel marketplace will best serve the public interest. Second, the analytical framework for the Commission's analysis of these rules is to be found in the Communications Act, and particularly in Section 202H and the cases that have been interpreting it. Under that framework, the FCC must take current competitive conditions into account as it reviews the broadcast ownership rules. Third, the Commission would be well served to base any judgments of these rules on real evidence, not on unsupported opinion. To that end, I agree with those who've said this before me that it's important to have current, realistic data that it takes full account of the impact of new media sources on broadcast stations and the audiences that they serve. If you will allow me, please, to expand on each of these points. My first point was that the public interest is best served by rules that allow broadcasters to compete effectively in the digital multimedia world. Now, local broadcasters continue to serve their listeners and viewers with a wide variety of entertainment, news, public affairs programming, and vital emergency information. Broadcasters have demonstrated a record of unparalleled service to their local communities. True, the formats and styles of broadcast stations are varied. They're not alike, and they shouldn't be. But it remains true that broadcasters provide service to their local communities even as the competitive business model under which they operate is under assault from multiple and growing sources in today's media world. I don't think it's going to surprise anybody here to hear me say that broadcasters believe that the FCC's rules must permit reasonable combinations of station ownership so that broadcasters can compete effectively and provide quality local service to their audiences. As the Commission itself has recognized, only competitively viable broadcast stations supported by adequate advertising revenues can serve the public interest effectively and provide a significant local presence. It takes money to provide up-to-the-minute news, local and national emergency information, and highly valued entertainment programming. Stations must be supported and sustained by the economics that make sense in today's world. Broadcasters cannot compete and serve their communities unless they have a somewhat level playing field with the new and varied competitors that are not subject to the same restrictions on local ownership. Now, to be clear, broadcasters are not calling for an end to all ownership regulation. But in light of competitive realities, the Commission must revise such rules as the newspaper cross-ownership ban that both the Commission and the reviewing court have recognized is out of date. The Commission must also recognize that the impact of these multi-channel providers have had on the competitive position of local television stations, as articulated by the D.C. Circuit, requires a review of those rules as well. Now, let me also clearly oppose any suggestion that restrictions on broadcast ownership should remain unchanged or even be increased. To support such views, one must believe that the media marketplace has not changed over the last several decades, or that the media marketplace is less competitive and less diverse than in light of the development of digital technology, numerous multi-channel video and audio services, and as well as the Internet. Such a position is clearly untenable. Now, I think it's very important to recall the state of the broadcast industry in the early 1990s, before some of the ownership restrictions were reformed to permit a more economically viable ownership structure. In 1992, for example, the Commission found that due to market fragmentation, many in the radio industry were experiencing serious economic stress. Specifically, stations were experiencing sharp decreases in operating profits and margins. By the early 1990s, more than half of the stations were losing money, and almost 300 radio stations had gone silent. That was particularly in the smaller markets. Indeed, the Commission concluded that radio's ability to serve the public interest had been substantially threatened. So this leads me to my second point, that the analytical framework for evaluating the ownership rules is found in the Communications Act and Section 202H of the 1996 Telecom Act, as well as the court cases that have interpreted it. Congress understood that the state of the industry in the 1990s was dismal or in trouble. Thus, the motivation behind the congressional directive that the FCC regularly evaluate the ownership rules was to preserve and promote the competitiveness of over-the-air broadcast stations. Congress found that significant changes in the audio and video marketplace called for substantial reform of congressional and commission oversight of the way that the broadcast industry develops and competes. It specifically noted that the explosion of video distribution technologies and subscription-based programming sources meant that the industry's ability to effectively compete and remain a vital element of the video marketplace was in dire straits. Congress directed the elimination of a number of the Commission's ownership rules, and it also directed the Commission to relax other local ownership rules. Section 202H is an important part of the paradigm, and in particular, I think that the Commission must observe the language of that provision, which requires the Commission to determine whether any of its ownership rules are necessary in the public interest as a result of competition. And it must also repeal or modify any regulation it determines to be no longer in the public interest. Now, I'm not going to go through an exhaustive tale of the litigation that has sustained much of the communications bar for the last several years in the wake of this provision. But I will note that the key lesson that really comes out of those cases is that the Commission must take current competitive conditions into account as it reviews the broadcast ownership rules. The current marketplace is marked by growth in competitors for listeners and viewers. I think that David Barrett has really gone through that. So if anything, the primary competitive related concern in today's digital marketplace is the continued ability of local broadcasters to compete effectively and to offer free over-the-air entertainment and information programming that the American public now relies on. Now, this is where my third principle comes into play. The Commission should base its decisions on real evidence. I think we're in agreement on that, not unsupported opinion. To that end, it is important to have current, realistic data that fully accounts for the impact that new media sources have on broadcast stations and the audiences they serve. Now, NAB has previously documented in detail the audience fragmentation and increasing competition for viewers and listeners and advertisers experienced by the stations. We noted, for example, that in the first 3 months of 2007, Internet advertising set new records by taking in $4.9 billion, a 26% increase over the previous year. Similarly, we have documented that cable's share of local television advertising has grown substantially. The record in this proceeding must include updates of this data. And the local ownership rules should be structured so that the traditional broadcaster and newer programming distributors, which all clearly compete for advertising revenue and audiences, can compete on an equitable playing field. Another study that would inform the Commission's decision on ownership rules would be an examination of investment trends. Investment is the lifeblood of any industry, so the FCC should endeavor to determine how its ownership policies affect investment in the media marketplace. In particular, the FCC should examine the difficulties that broadcast outlets have today in obtaining investment capital, and whether those difficulties are related to the asymmetric regulation of broadcast outlets in comparison to their competitors. In this regard, NAB notes that cable operators are not subject to local ownership rules, and the D.C. Circuit has again vacated the 30% horizontal ownership cap. This is important because anecdotal evidence suggests that investment capital flows more freely to lesser regulated media space. Now, you'll notice that my comments here have focused on competition, and I haven't really mentioned much about diversity and localism. And part of the reason for that is that having a healthy competitive broadcast industry is in fact the way that you foster both diversity and localism. Diversity through new entry into the market, localism and the ability of broadcasters to be able to provide the service that their communities need. So in conclusion, let me just mention that broadcasters, again, I'll state again, we're not calling for an end to all ownership regulation. We just want the modernization of out-of-date restrictions. We think that that reasonable reform will lead to a healthy industry that will promote the goals that the Commission is seeking to advance, and that the reform of the local ownership rules can help the stations do just that. Thank you very much.
That timing is pretty impressive. Thank you very much. We'll hear next from George Mahoney, who is Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of Media General.
Thank you, Bill, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I very much appreciate the Commission's invitation to address this workshop. As the FCC anticipates its mandated 2010 review of its ownership rules, my task is to address the Commission's 34-year-old ban on the common ownership of newspapers and television stations in the same market. It's a subject Media General knows quite a bit about. We've pre-filed 47 pages of testimony that contain a lot of our company's history with a cross-ownership ban, and that contain a lot of the legal reasons why that ban is unconstitutional and needs to be removed. In sum, the ban is an anachronism. But it's not just an innocent relic of the past, it's an actual, serious detriment to my industry, and it hurts consumers, and it hurts local communities. Its impact is particularly harsh on small and middle-sized markets, markets like those where Media General operates. I hope that my remarks this morning, my pre-filed testimony, and our discussion today will help to demonstrate why the rule is against the public policy of the country and should be eliminated in its entirety. I'd like to give you a little background on Media General. We own 18 network-affiliated television stations and 21 daily newspapers located primarily in the Southeast. Each of these properties has one, and more likely many more than one, website. We also own several interactive advertising enterprises, including an advergaming and entertainment company, a coupon and shopping company, and a wireless mobile marketing company. At Media General, we know that the customer is in charge, and we know that if we don't serve our markets well, we will fail. Or, put more positively, and in language that a number of people in this building have heard me use, Media General is customer-focused, and Media General is local. Putting our money where our mouth is, or in this case where our structure is, effective at the beginning of the third quarter of this year, Media General got rid of its old siloed structure that had included three platform-based divisions, that is, publishing, broadcast, and interactive. And we changed instead to 5 geographic market segments. They are Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Florida, the Mid-South, which is South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and Columbus, Ohio, and Providence, Rhode Island, where we have television stations, plus a 6th segment that includes interactive advertising services I mentioned a moment ago. This organizational change is important. It means that our market leaders now manage all the resources in their regions. That allows them to more closely connect to existing customers, and it creates new opportunities to reach new customers. We view this as a natural extension of our mission, which is to be the leading provider of high-quality news, information, and entertainment in the Southeast by continually building on our position of strength in strategically located markets. One of my other responsibilities at Media General is to oversee the process by which we create and test innovative new products. That doesn't mean that I'm involved in the actual creation of new products to better serve our local communities. That's the responsibility of our local managers. Rather, I oversee the process by which that's done. I can see from my vantage point that we're getting a lot better at innovating. By listening to the customer and by reaching out to non-customers in our markets, we should be able to extend our reach, and we should be able to fill in some of the open spaces on our map. A multi-platform approach is critical to these local and often hyper-local efforts. Nowhere is that more evident than in our 5 convergence markets. That is, those markets where we own a television station, a newspaper, and Internet assets. Let me give you an example of how this works in the context of local news gathering and what we call a web-first approach to breaking news. We know that appointment journalism is dead. A subscriber used to have to wait until we delivered a newspaper to his or her door at 5:30 in the morning. And a television viewer used to have to wait until 6 o'clock or the 11 o'clock news in the evening to find out what was happening in his or her community. Those days are gone. Appointment journalism has been replaced by a continuous news cycle. Here's how that looks on the ground. We know, because we can track it, that web traffic spikes around lunchtime as people check in from their desks at work for local news about their communities. If we're going to serve those customers effectively, this means that we have to have the latest local news on our websites by 11:30 in the morning. That, in turn, means that our journalists typically start the day out in the field with laptops and video cameras, filing stories and video remotely so that our viewers will have the latest news at lunch. Then, during the day, viewers typically comment on those stories, sometimes also giving us additional news tips, and we continuously update our web stories. During the afternoon, our journalists may start preparing updates of these stories for the 6 o'clock television news, and they may start working on perspective pieces rather than breaking news stories for our daily newspaper readers to see the next morning. It's in this fashion that we're able to deliver local news to our customers when, where, and however they want it. This makes Media General platforms in the community the go-to place for local news. We know this multi-platform model works. It gives our communities what they need, and by connecting advertisers to these local audiences, it allows us to fund this local news gathering effort. And make no mistake, local news is very expensive. Over the last couple of years, we've had to match our cost structure to the revenues that have been available in our markets. Overall, that means that we've had to reduce our workforce from about 7,100 people to 5,200 people. That's been very painful, but it's also been necessary. And today, as we see what we hope are signs that advertising spending is firming somewhat, this gives us a strong position from which to innovate and grow, all focusing on our franchise, which is local. Everyone hears a lot of consternation about the future of journalism, but our television stations typically are ranked 1 or 2 in their markets on local news, and that's particularly true in our cross-owned markets where we have multiple platforms, that is, multiple access points to reach consumers with the news they demand by nearly whatever means they demand it. I hope the Commission will consider this model as it reviews its ownership rules. Cross-ownership restrictions of any sort make no sense in today's multi-platform world. There are a host of legal reasons why these restrictions should be eliminated. I've given you 47 pages on that. But I hope you can see from my comments this morning that it's also possible to deliver high-quality local news to small and middle-sized markets, the very ones that are most jeopardized by the pinch of today's lower revenues and the high cost of local news gathering. One of the real tragedies from the Commission's inaction on cross-ownership is that media companies don't know what the rules are. Some of Media General's peer companies have given up on real multi-platform approaches, selling off their television stations or partitioning their companies. While I don't think anyone these days has the money for large-scale acquisitions, it is still possible to swap properties to better align assets and platforms in ways that can preserve and even enhance local news in small and middle-sized communities. The Commission should endorse that goal. The obstacle that stands in the way of more and better local news is, of course, the cross-ownership ban. As I've said in my written testimony, complete repeal of this ban is long, long, long overdue. I've been coming to Washington on this issue for over 8 years. Little has changed. At a minimum, the Commission now should act quickly. This advanced workshop is a good sign. What I've seen missing from the Commission's analytical process so far is the way the real world actually works. Therefore, I suggest that the FCC talk with those in the industry involved in cross-ownership. with prominent journalism professors to see how today's students are being prepared to work in a multi-platform world, with advertisers to see that they in fact want multi-platform access to their communities, and with the financial community to find out what would make investors interested in broadcasting for the future, thereby keeping it healthy. I appreciate your invitation and the opportunity to provide these remarks. I look forward to our discussion today and to your questions.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we will hear from James Winston, Executive Director and General Counsel of the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill, and members of the Media Bureau for inviting me to speak this morning. NABOB is a trade association representing the interests of 240 radio stations and 10 television stations around the country. We have two principal objectives. The first is to increase the number of African American owned radio and television stations, and the second is to increase the business climate in which we operate. As the public notice recognizes, the Commission has historically regulated broadcasting, seeking to balance three policy goals: localism, diversity, and competition. Unfortunately, in the past, when the balance has been struck among the Commission's conflicting goals, the goal that always receives short shrift is the goal of diversity. The diversity goal must encompass policies that promote minority ownership of broadcast stations. However, the public notice did not even mention the promotion of minority ownership. The minority ownership aspect of diversity is far too important a part of that subject not to be mentioned as a pivotal issue in this review. Indeed, rejecting the Commission's 2002 review, the Third Circuit Court of Appeal specifically identified the Commission's failure to address minority ownership as a matter warranting reversal of the 2002 order. If the Commission does consider the state of minority ownership as part of this review, it will see that the problems are staggering. As was pointed out by Professor Catherine Sandoval when she released her invaluable new study of minority ownership on Monday, the Commission's records are woefully inadequate with respect to being able to identify the number of minority-owned stations in the United States. Through her own very extensive study, Professor Sandoval was able to demonstrate that the number of minority owners continues to fall at a precipitous pace. Therefore, before the Commission can fully answer the questions it has posed in this proceeding, it needs much better information on how many minority broadcast station owners there are, where they are, and the condition of their ownership. As Professor Sandoval's study demonstrates, for too many of the existing minority owners, the condition of their ownership is very tenuous. For many minority owners, the tenuous nature of their ownership can be traced directly to their lending institutions. Many minority broadcasters are being threatened with foreclosure by banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms. Because of financial difficulties brought on by the credit crisis and the economic recession, many of these banks are the same banks who receive billions of dollars in bailouts from the taxpayers without the assurance that those billions would be used to help small businesses survive the economic downturn. Instead, those banks are hoarding their billions and forcing minority broadcasters into foreclosure or bankruptcy. In recent press reports, some of these banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms, which have foreclosed on numerous broadcasters, are now complaining that the Commission's ownership restrictions may hinder them from taking over more stations. The article suggested that these lenders may come to the Commission seeking to further relax the Commission's attribution rules to permit such additional ownership by them. Therefore, NABOB submits that one of the issues that should be addressed in this proceeding is whether the attribution rules need to be strengthened to prevent excessive control of the broadcast industry by banks, hedge funds, and private equity firms. Adding to the woes of minority broadcasters is the Arbitron Audience Measurement Company. The Commission has a notice of inquiry pending to determine whether it should investigate Arbitron's new personal people meter audience measurement methodology. NABOB and the PPM Coalition have demonstrated that the PPM methodology discriminates against stations serving minority audiences, particularly young minority audiences. As a result, Arbitron has been sued by the Attorneys General in New York, New Jersey, and Florida, and entered into settlements with the Attorneys General in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. Therefore, NABOB submits that the questions being investigated by the Commission need to be expanded and the emphasis needs to shift. Additional questions the Commission should ask in this proceeding are, do any of the Commission's ownership rules impede its efforts to promote minority ownership? Do any of the Commission's ownership rules need to be modified to aid the Commission in the promotion of minority ownership? Does the Commission need to obtain additional information in its efforts to promote minority ownership? I look forward to the question and answer period so we can discuss these many issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now take a 10-minute break, and then we'll engage the panelists in a discussion. Thank you. Welcome back. Your thoughtful presentations prompt a lot of questions, but first I would like to give each of the panelists an opportunity just to comment on what they've heard from the other panelists, to express amens, to disagree if there are disagreements, and then I'll have some questions of my own. And we might sort of start in reverse order. James, if you'd like to start first, just anything that's prompted by what you've heard from the other panelists.
As is generally the case when I get to sit down with representatives of NAB, we usually disagree over the ownership rules. And I think we continue to view the consolidation of the industry over the course of the last decade since the enactment of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 as a source of the many problems that minority broadcasters have faced and why we have seen our numbers diminish over that period of time. Since 1996, the number of African American owned companies owning broadcast stations has dropped by about 35%. And that's because of consolidation and squeezing people out of the industry. So I don't think a conversation that begins with further relaxation of the media ownership rules is one that NABOB would ever support.
George, thank you. Oh, well, we'll get to you. But George is in between. George.
Thank you, Bill. What I heard a lot of was, well, there's so many other things the Commission has to take into account in these ownership proceedings. It has to take into account diversity, it has to take into account localism, it has to take into account attribution rules. It is so easy to say, yeah, all that stuff's wonderful, but that's not what the statutory charge is for the Commission. It is competition. That's what the Commission should be looking at for this quadrennial proceeding. And frankly, taking a lot of other things is, I mean, if the Commission wants to go do that, that's fine, but not this proceeding. This proceeding needs to move forward. We've been working on these things for 10 years, and we need to be doing it quickly. We need to get a resolution. And as I said, the industry really needs to understand what the rules of the road are. Not having the rules of the road creates noise around the industry and investors go away. And that's not where the Commission wants this, and that's certainly not where broadcasters in the industry want it.
Okay, Jane.
Now my turn, huh? I wanted to actually focus a little bit on what I saw as areas of agreement. And I'm a little bit surprised, Jim. I think we have a lot of areas of agreement. It may be that there's the ultimate area of concern on, how you change the rules. But I think that what we were all saying was that we need to have an industry that can be invested in order to have, the diversity of ownership. You were concerned about some of the debt structures and such things. I think that part of the reason that you have to look carefully at that is that you need to have an industry that can be invested in if you're going to get new folks in there. And that's a very important point that I think we should not be losing sight of here. I think some of the other agreements that I heard this morning were that we all think that we should be relying on real data and that we need more information, and we agree that the Commission should be collecting more information and know what the real ownership structures are that are out there right now, and that's important to informing their decisions. But the data that should be collected, I wanted to emphasize, should be related to legitimate objectives. It should be related to the specifics of this proceeding, of how we structure the ownership. We don't need to go off into tangents in terms of data on things that might be interesting, but not really related to the ownership world. I did also want to, in the proceedings that you had over the last couple of days, there was a comment that was made that caused me some concern, talking a little bit about reporter pools. And I think that the nature of the comment was that it was somehow contrary to the ownership rules to have reporter pools. And to me, that particular comment made no sense because I think that it's an efficiency Mr. Barrett, I'm sure, can talk to this more effectively than I can, but it is stations use a common reporter pool occasionally to have greater efficiency. It doesn't mean that they are colluding or changing the data or anything else. They're simply having an effective means of being able to get information out to the public. And so I wanted to just make a comment on that. I think I'll stop there for right now. I'll probably have more.
Thank you, Jessica.
So I'd like to just echo Jane. I think we had several areas of agreement. One was on data collection. The other is that this process should move forward as quickly as possible so that all parties can have certainty, though I do think we have rules in place right now. I understand those might change in the future, but I do think there is some certainty as to what the rule is, as it stands. I would try not to get into the substance, but I do think we need media ownership rules. I disagree that they're unconstitutional. We have the current precedent in CCB v. FCC, which is an old case, supports their constitutionality. But also, the Supreme Court had another chance to take a look at the constitutional implications in Prometheus v. FCC, and it denied cert there. So if it wanted to change their ruling on the constitutional issue, it could have done so then. Lastly, I think this proceeding has always considered, first and foremost, the public interest, and that includes diversity, competition, and localism. And so I don't think we're off base here in asking that those considerations remain part of this debate.
Thank you. David.
I think in terms of local media organizations as having a core mission of informing the public, entertaining the public, and serving the public. And in this country, we have a localized society. We have, I think, smartly going back, almost a century, created a communication system in this country that is hyper-local, covering 210 markets. And we see the benefits of that in contrast to countries and societies that are more national in their scope. And nothing speaks to that more than yesterday's election, last night's election, that it was our democracy at work on a hyper local basis, and you've got local media that reflects that every day. And I think that as we think about that principle and we think about the benefit of that principle to Americans and consumers and customers in our society, we ought to do everything we can from a public policy point of view to create an environment where localism will thrive. And I think we have to remind ourselves that this is not a static situation. It's a very dynamic situation, and the rules of the road that made sense in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s don't necessarily make sense. I believe they don't make any sense at all. They're not relevant today when we think of how media has changed. But this notion of preserving the localized benefits of our communications and broadcast systems, our media system, is of utmost importance, and I think ought to be a high priority for the Commission.
The statute directs us to consider whether our ownership rules are in the public interest in light of competition, and clearly there's agreement that we need to look at the most current data about the state of competition and of the industry. We're now in an economic slump, which has affected certainly the broadcast industry as well as the newspaper industry, and I guess my question for any and all of you is, in assessing what rules we should have, how do we consider whether some of this current instability in the market is cyclical as opposed to secular or structural? We don't have the benefit of waiting for 10 years to look back to see which it was or to what extent it was one versus the other. How do we factor that uncertainty into our assessment of the rules, since we have to decide in the shorter term?
Well, I'll say that I think one really needs to look at contemporary data And that is the hard call. What is secular? What is cyclical? And, I think from our company's point of view, a certain portion of the downturn and the economic impact that we've been dealing with is certainly cyclical, but an enormous part of it is also secular. And I think that applies to the newspaper business, and it applies to the results of consolidation and the results of new choices has had a profound effect on where advertising dollars go and what listening behaviors and viewing behaviors occur. Bob and I were talking at the break, and I'm one of those who believes that the money in this industry follows the audience, and the audience has gone to a lot of very different and scattered places, and we've got to be mindful of that. I use as an example the Boston television market. In 02 and 04, revenues for the broadcast stations in Boston aggregated north of $500 million. In 08 and 09, revenues for that same group of stations are less than $300 million. So there's been $200 million go out of the television market there. And over the same period of time, the Boston Globe has gone from being a profitable business enterprise to a business enterprise that incurs staggering operating losses. And that's driven by a profound secular change in how advertising dollars are being allocated in the marketplace. Some to new media ventures, but they don't fully substitute, go from column A to column B in whole. You're dealing with advertisers in this country who are allocating a smaller portion of their own revenues to advertising. Advertising as a portion of GDP is contracting. I view that as a structural change as well as a cyclical change.
Bill, I'd second that. If you think on the newspaper side for a second, the three pillars usually for newspapers have been classified, autos, real estate. Classified's gone. It's on the internet. There's very little in newspapers anymore, and it's not coming back. That is a structural change. Autos, I can hope come back, but look at the changes in the auto industry. And there are big changes there. And I don't think we're likely to see it come back the way it had, the way it was. Real estate, we can hope, is cyclical, but I don't know, and there's a lot of internet competition on the real estate side as well. TV stations, traditionally local television stations, look to local auto dealers. And the world has changed for those guys a lot. Some of them aren't even there anymore. So I think it's important for the Commission, as it looks at these kinds of questions, to go out and look at what the real world is all about. And so you see these revenue declines and categories that are gone for the type of media that we're talking about. And then you see the fragmenting audiences. And that tells you, I think, as a Commission, that the market really has changed. And that this thing that the Commission's supposed to look at 202H, competition, is a vastly different thing than it was a year ago, and particularly than it was for the thing that I care about in 1975. The world isn't the same, and the Commission's rules need to reflect that. The Commission's data gathering needs to go out and look and see what's happened in the real world, not some conjecture about what would happen if. Go see what's happening.
Other thoughts, Jessica?
Yeah, I think this is a real difficult position that the Commission is in here. I'm hearing from a lot of parties that we're not quite sure whether or to what degree this is cyclical or circular. I would urge in the meantime to not do anything too drastic, knowing that in 4 years you'll get to revisit this again.
A chilling thought. Thank you.
As it always has been. It was worse when it was 2 years. But I think that the theme for the Commission ought to be not to exacerbate the cyclical changes. Those, in fact, really are there, and we know that the economy goes, and we've seen it over the years, that it goes up and down. I think as you look at your rules, you need to assume that those cyclical changes do exist. but look for the changes that are the real game changers. What are the structural ones, and you shouldn't assume that those are always going to be the same. We've talked about the advance of new competitors, the movement of classifieds to the internet. Those are the game changers now. But I think what the Commission has to do as it's examining this as rules is to figure out which ones those are, rather than just a downturn in particular advertising.
Minority ownership in the television industry is so small right now that actually NABOB doesn't get involved very much in television issues because we have so few members. We only got 10 television stations left. 5 years ago, we had 21 African American owned television stations. So we've seen a huge hit in the industry, primarily because of consolidation in the industry. So when I look at the newspaper television cross ownership issue, I'm concerned about the ripple effect of that consolidation. I think it does present some difficult questions for the Commission, but as Jessica's pointed out, if you decide that something is cyclical that's not cyclical, I mean that's not cyclical that is cyclical, then you may create a situation where you've exacerbated multiple ownership issues, and the industry as a whole is worse off as a result of allowing these cross ownerships.
Since we've seen that at least the percentage of broadcast stations that are minority and women-owned has dropped, how do we get at the relationship of our ownership rules to that drop? How do we sort out the impact of consolidation or of our existing rules from the other factors that may contribute to that?
I guess I should lead off on that. What we've seen, and once again, I want to commend Professor Catherine Sandoval for the work that she did in the study that she released on Monday here. What she has done is actually contact some of these owners and former owners to find out what the reasons were for them being in or out of the industry, and I think that's going to have to be a part. I mean, I think we've got many anecdotal stories about people being squeezed out by consolidation, but I think a more detailed investigation of owners and former owners is going to be necessary to see what impact the Commission's ownership rules have had, so that we can make some assessment about what the impact of those rules would be going forward.
Jessica, do you have further thoughts?
I agree.
In that regard, I just wanted to note, I think that you can't just look at absolute numbers. You have to do, in my testimony I mentioned the access to capital problem, and I know this is one that we agree that there's a access to capital issue. You can't have ownership rules that make that access to capital harder. It will have an impact on minority ownership. It will have an impact that will be detrimental. You have got to have a healthy industry that says that someone who wants to break into the industry can get there, that they can get an appropriate size and scope in any given market to be able to effectively compete against it, and that's not something that you can just legislate away, because what you do is you create artificial restrictions that will cause more problems than they will help.
There also are, Bill, in the past there have been tax certificates and there have been some industry initiatives to work on ways using the tax laws to promote diverse ownership. And we're absolutely in favor of those kinds of things. That's good for the industry. It's good for minority ownership. It's the kind of thing that the Commission can go champion up on the Hill. But I don't think that it's the kind of thing that this ownership proceeding could get bogged down on, or should get bogged down on, pending some action up on the Hill. This Commission has an obligation to move forward, and I hope that it does.
Right. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I don't want to hog the mic. I'll if you want to make a comment, I just wanted to. I want to respond to Jane at some point.
I just concur with George. I view the opportunity and the history that there's been of minority tax credits as something that ought to be championed by this Commission. And I believe the NAB member stations would have been and would be supportive of such a suggestion and concept.
Have been and continue to be.
And NABOB has always appreciated the NAB support on restoring the minority tax certificate. The problem, however, we've seen with respect to access to capital is that in recent years, capital has not been accessible for new entrants, because if you come into an investment house and say, I'm looking to purchase a standalone radio station in X market, the first thing they do is look at the competitive market and say, well, you're going up against X company that has 8 stations in the market. You're going up against Y station that has 5 stations in the market. You're going up against Z station, company that has 4 stations in the market. We don't think you can be financially viable with one standalone station. And so what happens is capital is denied to that new entrant. So the ownership rules are very much involved in the access to capital issue, and they can't really be separated out.
I'd only point out that I get the same questions from banks that he's getting from banks. It's not a question of what you look like when you come in. It's a question of, are they going to be able to make money off of your ownership of something else? And capital is very hard to come by in this industry right now. I mean, it is non-existent in this industry right now for almost every participant.
Some writers have suggested that one thing that's happened both in newspapers and in broadcasting is that we've gone from a paradigm of family-owned companies who considered what they were doing a mission and were happy to live with a 5 or 10% return toward a situation in which more stations or newspapers are owned by public corporations that expect a larger return. Do you think there's any truth to that? And if there is that something that the FCC should even try to do anything about?
I can take that one because I have both. I have an interesting stock structure where I have a family that controls my board, and I also have public stockholders. So I see both sides of the issue. But I would tell you that what the FCC needs to look at is the effect of what's going on in the markets. And ownership is what it is, but at the end of the day, if you have a couple of stations that are competing to be number 1 or number 2, they're both competing to be number 1 in the market because that's how you get advertising dollars. That is going to continue as the model for the industry no matter what. I can't promise you what's going to happen for the stations that are 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 in a market, but those 2 are going to continue to compete, and we've seen that they're going to continue to compete on local news, which is a terrific thing for the FCC and for the communities that we participate in. So if I were the commission, I would say, how can I promote that? How can I get the rules of the road straight so that people understand what the rules for competition are? And can I get about doing that quickly, because I've got 2 industries, newspaper and television, that are obviously struggling right now.
I work for a company that's been in the business since 1887. It's a family-owned company, and I can assure you that no one's ever been satisfied with a 5 or 10% return. We wouldn't have been in the business for 122 years if that was the case. You need better growth than that to participate and grow the business and to be involved in new media enterprises. Beyond the standards that presently exist for vetting ownership of media properties, I would be very wary of the Commission engaging itself in profiling different kinds of owners as being good or bad for the business. I think the human condition is that there are good and bad and across a spectrum of those that are good at the business, those that are good stewards, those that are not good stewards, and the marketplace ultimately provides a solution. There is a Darwinian outcome with respect to how a lot of these businesses are managed, and I think we're probably the one company that's been in the business longer than virtually anyone else, and that speaks to some good decisions that were made along the way, and satisfaction with 5% returns. People who haven't had long careers, if that's what they delivered to the family that owns our company.
Jim?
Yeah, I think Commissioner Copps has spoken about the change in ownership in the industry over the last several years, and specifically he's spoken about increasing ownership of broadcast properties by private equity firms and other Wall Street entities, which I think evidence suggests is changing the nature of the industry and is creating many highly leveraged transactions, which then in turn cause cost cutting and other changes in the industry where the public interest often suffers because of cutbacks in news and information and other activities. So I think it is something that's appropriate for this consideration here.
Ken Faree yesterday, who was here for the 2002 media ownership review, suggested that after seeing the industry go through a wave of consolidation, we're actually seeing now a wave of deconsolidation in the industry. And again, whether that's cyclical or secular is unclear. But do you agree that we're seeing less consolidation in the industry as a trend now?
Well, I think that's probably the case. I mean, the reality is across the whole spectrum of American business, a lot of these big transactions haven't produced the kind of financial results that were expected. And you can say that occurred in the media space, but it's occurred in the banking space and the airline space and so on. So I think you are seeing some unraveling of those deals, in part driven by the very distressed economic circumstances that those companies have engaged in. If you look at one common denominator to stress on business, it's the accumulation of too much debt. And a lot of companies in the go-go years took on an enormous amount of debt and were not insulated from the cyclical downturn, and they're over-leveraged. They can't meet their debt obligations, and that results in some very horrific things. The best managed companies in every sector are the ones that have been more disciplined in terms of what their balance sheets look like.
I do think we have seen some deconsolidation, but I don't think this should be taken to mean that the regulations are somehow unnecessary. I anticipate that when the market bounces back, we might see more moving towards more consolidation.
I guess I'll make a generalized, I'm very worried about generalization. I think when people come at this and say, just because of particular financial structure that means that produces X result in terms of the actual service that a station provides. I think there's not evidence to support that. I would want the Commission to be able to really look at that before making generalized statements that are based on it. I will say, however, on a generalized statement basis, that cutting off access to capital from whatever sources for any part of the industry, deciding that no one could take on any more debt or no one could, have access to capital that comes from, certain types of investors that we've decided we don't like very much, would be a very bad thing for the industry and certainly one troubling from a from a legal point of view.
Bill, I think I'd say that I'm not sure about deconsolidation. I am certain that there are fewer players and fewer viable players, especially right now. We've got a lot of people in bankruptcy on both newspapers and television. But we've also seen newspapers cut back, stop distributing actual newspapers, and begin to distribute only electronically. And we've seen television stations cut back on news, and some stations stop doing news simply because it's too expensive. So I think that the thing to concern the Commission is what's going on there, and what, as a Commission, can we do about that?
I observe that these TV stations serve the public interest. And if there is an inability for stations to continue to serve the public interest at the high quality level that it currently exists, that's a bad public policy outcome. And what I don't sense here is a sense of urgency about what a tough spot the business is in, radio and television. These are businesses that historically have all been profitable. There are some very good stations on both operating basis and after-tax basis are not profitable any longer, and they can't sustain this level of service. I think it's a terrible commentary that strong newspapers may go out of business, have gone out of business in this country. I don't think that's good for our society. I think it is valuable that stations in New Orleans and stations in Albuquerque and stations in Boston do the extraordinary amount of public service that they do, and that there are limitations today which are imposed on us that aren't imposed on other sectors of the community. You can own a cable system in Boston, Massachusetts that serves 85% of the marketplace, and you can own a big television station. The big television station, which may take 20% of the TV revenues and 7% of total ad revenues in the marketplace, can't own another top 4 television station. I mean, that is not a balanced playing field, and I submit it's not in the public interest at the end of the day if that television station is marginalized in the marketplace.
I think any deconsolidation that's been seen in the last year or so is purely cyclical. I think that there will be another wave of consolidation when the credit crisis eventually eases and the economy begins to recover. And I'm not sure that's in the public interest.
As we strive to make our decision as factually based as possible, one of the things that we're trying to do is to develop the best metrics for what it is we're trying to achieve. Everyone seems to agree that local news and public affairs is one of the great contributions of broadcasters, both TV and radio. How do we gauge the amount of local news that's being provided? Are we looking at outputs in terms of numbers of hours, inputs in terms of the numbers of reporters who are on staffs, and then how do we relate that metric to the impact in one direction or another of our ownership rules?
Let me try that one. I think that the only thing that the Commission can look to that's going to have any consistency over time is output. How many hours of news are being produced? If I think about what's going on with journalists in our industry right now, I have something that at Media General we're calling digital journalists. People that go out and shoot stories on their own. That used to take a big fancy truck and 2 or 3 people to go out and produce a local news story. The technology's changed. The kids that are coming out of journalism school have changed. And indeed, some even of our older reporters have changed, and they've figured out how to use this new technology. So I don't think that counting journalists is the answer. I think that you're trying to figure out how is the community being served with local information. And so I think the thing to look at is the output of those hours. And I think that going beyond that probably gets the Commission into content kinds of issues, which I don't think it wants to get into.
We have some stations that are independent stations that do little news, but they are actively engaged in the community. They contribute enormously to the markets in which we compete. We have a station in Tampa that's the number 7 station in the market. It doesn't have an affiliation. We compete with Media General in that marketplace, and a smart strategy is not to introduce local news on that station in Tampa, Florida, but a better strategy is to have that station engaged at the grassroots with all manner of community things that distinguish the station and I think rationalize the kind of service that it provides, just as there are different formats of radio stations and different kinds of service that radio stations provide and a level of engagement. To me, it shouldn't be measured by X amount of hours of news output on a given station. There is no one solution that's going to serve a diverse system of television and radio in this country.
And is there a way in which we can measure what you described?
Well, I think there is. I mean, we report on the scope of the activities that we do in the marketplace through a license renewal process. And I think that's our station. When some of the road shows were occurring a few years ago, people spoke on behalf of the kind of work that our stations do above and beyond news or instead of news. I think that's a harder thing to get your hands on, but I think it's possible.
Jim?
I can remember back in the day when Jane and I were at the FCC, and I think Bob and Mania were here at the time, and the commission had specific guidelines for the provision of local news, local public service. It made it efficient for the commission to measure. It made it predictable for the broadcaster to know what its obligations were with respect to getting its license renewed. And I know it's not politically correct these days to talk about going back to those kinds of measurement systems, but I think that the commission disserved the public interest when it went away from those measures, and I think that ought to be on the table as part of this review, that looking at those former measures, ascertainment, all of it should be back on the table.
I guess I'm a little concerned if we only consider a pure quantity of news. There might be 4 hours of news on a station on any given day, but how much of that is cycled over and over into 30-minute segments of the same news over and over again? I'm not saying that happens all the time, but I guess we wouldn't really know if all we're looking at is quantity. I like the idea of looking at the number of reporters. I think more reporters equals more in-depth coverage of the issues. It would be hard, I imagine, for one reporter to cover several issues in the kind of depth that 3 reporters could. As for the guidelines that Mr. Winston brings up, we filed comments in a separate proceeding, the localism proceeding, proposing that some form of those guidelines be reinstated in the license renewal process. I'm not sure. I think the impact on localism needs to be covered in this proceeding, but I'm not sure if the best way moving forward is for us to consider guidelines in the context of the quadrennial review. But I do think it should be addressed, and that is an issue that's already teed up.
I'll just sort of summarize, I guess, in the sense that your question, Bill, was what's the metric? Can we look at a metric of local news? And I think that what you've heard is that just local news per se may not be the right metric because stations provide service to their communities in different ways. The metric is how are stations providing service to their communities. And that's something that's not easy to do with a check the box. And I think that was some of the problems that the Commission recognized when it moved away from a check the box formula, that it tended to cause stations to just, you just try to get that, and it doesn't really capture the service that is being provided to the community. So I think the metric that you need to have is one that is based on how the stations are serving the communities, and that's unfortunately not one that's an easy, objective type of standard. I think it's got to be explained in the renewal process on a station-by-station basis.
Bill, if I could, just on 2 points. On whether news is just cycled over and over again, and so that generates hours, I would simply point out that it doesn't take the viewing public long to figure that out, and the eyeballs run away from stations that do that. I mentioned continuous news, and if you don't update news and provide current information to audiences, the audiences go somewhere where that is happening. So it doesn't happen by any station that's going to be successful. The other thing I would say, that I heard ascertainment come up, and I can't let it go. In a pre-1984 world, television stations often had 2 people filling out government forms. That's what they did. If that happened today, with the economics of television stations, I can tell you how we would reach those people, how we would get those people filling out forms. I would take 2 people off the street who are reporting news now, and I would put them at desks filling out government forms, and that would be a tragedy.
There have been a number of references to the relationship between our ownership rules and other FCC regulations, the renewal process and so forth. And that leads me to ask, as a general matter, I think of our ownership rules as attacking ownership not as an end in itself, but with the theory that a certain ownership structure may produce behaviors that are desired, and that it's less intrusive to try to produce those behaviors through structural regulation than through behavioral regulation. It's a bit like the way the Antitrust Division approaches its merger reviews. We can, of course, regulate behavior more directly. There are respects in which we do that now with our political broadcasting rules and others. The Commission has done more of that in the past. Can you tell me, as we consider our ownership rules, to what extent should we think, well, it may be easier to attack some of these same problems through behavioral regulation versus structural regulation? And which would be less undesirable in your mind?
Well, in my mind, more desirable would be a structural approach, and that was the essence of my remarks as to how to establish a metric for ownership that would comport with existing antitrust law. There is a standard of evaluation that focuses on, under concentrated, moderately concentrated, heavily concentrated in a marketplace. This HHI theory of examining structure and ownership in any industry in a marketplace, I think is so rationally applied to our industry at this point in time that it bears great consideration, and it takes out some of the subjective assessments of how one deals with a new ownership regime. I think it's the sensible way to proceed. We suggested a 30% ownership level, subject to a bright line test, and then using this HHI model to determine the level of concentration that would result from that. There are some who believe that 30 was a very conservative approach. It could be a 35 or 40% number and still run the traps at the Justice Department in a satisfactory way. But I happen to think that that is a rational way to approach this, and would put the industry on a lot better footing.
I think, as Jim alluded to a few moments ago, some of us have been doing this for a long time, and the Commission moved away from behavioral type approach towards a structural approach because of the legal pitfalls that I think attend to behavioral type of regulation. You run into very quickly a question of whether government is favoring one speaker over another, and some fairly serious constitutional type of issues. So I would just voice a word of caution we should look at the past to see where we should go in the future.
Another thing I'd add with respect to our suggestion here is that we were sensitive to the difficulties the Commission and its regulatory policy has had in dealing with judicial scrutiny. And we felt that the suggestion that we make using this HAI standard allows one to navigate judicial scrutiny with a better chance of success.
I would only like to add that the Commission never ran into any legal challenges in terms of the constitutionality of its numerical guidelines for local news and public affairs. That looking at more subjective criteria does run that risk, but those guidelines never did, and I think they are something that could bear looking at here to get the Commission in a position where it can do some efficient regulation in this area.
Bill, I think I agree with Jane on the behavioral as being sort of slippery slope kinds of area for the Commission. On the structural side, I would point out that in particular on the cross-ownership issue, the Commission is favoring particular types of owners and particular types of ownership structures right now. It is saying that some people can't own television stations. And that raises, for me, very serious constitutional questions, which I've talked about. And so I would think that the Commission needs to be very careful on the structural side, too. And I think, obviously, that it's crossed the line and has been crossing the line on cross-ownership, and that rule itself affronts both the First and Fifth Amendment.
I'll pick up on something that George said, but the question is really for the whole panel. George, you mentioned that in a number of the markets in which you have an ownership of both a newspaper and a TV station, the TV station is typically first or second in its market, and produces a lot of local news. In assessing the effect of newspaper broadcast cross-ownership, should we look at that, but also at any effect there may be on the total amount of local news in the market? For example, whether other stations are being suppressed by your success?
Yeah, you should look at that. But what I'll tell you, because we've done studies on this, is that when you have one station producing more local news, the other stations in the market tend to mirror that and do the same kind of a thing. And it makes all the sense in the world. It's a competitive response. If I'm the number 2 station, I've got to try harder because I need to be number 1. I need to be number 1 because I get more advertising dollars if I'm number 1. And so if somebody raises the bar on what I need to do to compete in a market, that's a raised bar, and I got to deal with it. And so I think that as long as you've got stations that are interested in local news and interested in trying to be number 1 and 2, and that's every market in America, that you're going to have a rising tide of local news, which means at the end of the day more choice, but it also means a better informed citizenry. And so I think the public policy of the Commission falls right in line with cross-ownership and allowing exactly the kinds of things that we're talking about, because it does tend to produce, and the studies show this, more local news in communities.
I agree that we should be looking at the total, what the cross-ownership does to the total news in the market and not just the news on that particular station. And I'd be really interested to see the studies.
They're in the record.
As we try to get the best data that we can, I'm concerned that some of the values that we're promoting in connection with the ownership rules may be more easily quantifiable than others. And to take one example, one of our scholars suggested that one aspect of the diversity goal was what he called, I think, the democratic safeguard value, which is that if you have multiple voices in a community, that serves as a protection against one dominant voice influencing public opinion in a predominant way. And the suggestion that he made was that once we've determined on a strict competition analysis what would be the ideal degree of concentration in a market, we might want to favor less concentration than that in order to make sure that this democratic safeguard principle is protected. Could you give me your thoughts on that?
Well, it begs the question of what he considers voices. The study that we did 6-7 years ago suggested there were 39 voices, and that was pre-internet, et cetera. So, I think that gets to the essence of it. If it is limited to what many think are the principal voices in the marketplace, I think that's intellectually dishonest. I think one has to give equal credence to smaller boutique kinds of voices in the same way you give credence to larger, more powerful voices.
Adding on that, I think it's the point is really you can't pretend that there are only broadcast voices in any given market. I mean, this goes back to the basic point that you've really got to look across the whole platform. You have to understand all of the different inputs that go into the diversity of voices and the democracy in the market, and certainly what we've seen in terms of the importance of the voices that come out on the internet and through any number of different places certainly can't be discounted.
Bill, I mentioned in my comments that I thought the commission should go out and look and see what's going on in the real world. I don't know what a democratic safeguard is, but it isn't in the real world. That seems to me to be something that might come out of an academic institution, no disrespect, but that's not the real world. There is no shortage, as Jane mentioned, of voices in local communities. It is just not an issue. And the fact that you, in today's world, that you would think that somebody could control local opinion is laughable. Can't happen.
I wouldn't consider it a laughable concept. I think there are certainly differences in the ability of different media to influence audiences. I don't think anybody would suggest that a full-power television station and a daytime AM radio station are capable of impacting audiences in the same way or to the same extent. So I think that some, and I don't know what form the democratic safeguard would take, but I don't think it should be dismissed out of hand as not something the Commission needs to look at when examining competition in these markets.
Our existing rules focus narrowly on concentration in a particular market, such as local television market, or cross-ownership between two markets, such as newspapers and broadcasting. In an earlier effort, the Commission developed something called a diversity index, which attempted to look more broadly at concentration across all the different media that might be competing together. And David, I take your proposal today at least would be a step in that direction, in that you would consider radio and television and newspapers all together.
Yes.
Should we be looking to try to measure and control that kind of overall concentration in a market? Is that feasible, even if it might be abstractly desirable?
Considering it, I don't think it's the practical way to look at the media landscape in a local marketplace. I think the FCC's mandate won't extend itself to the newspaper industry or other media information industries, but I think it's absolutely relevant if one looks at, in Baltimore, Maryland, what are the different media choices that one has, that one looks broadly. The Towson Times is a bona fide media voice in that marketplace, and so is the newspaper in Catonsville, as well as the Baltimore Sun and WBAL Television and WBAL Radio, and the websites that are operated by these different media institutions. So, I think that gets to the relevancy of the analysis, and does it recognize different choices that are available for media consumers, and how do they use them? And one can statistically measure traffic on all of these sites, and it is, I think, relevant to assess that.
Bill, I spent a lot of time talking with Michael Powell about the diversity index. I know it was well-intentioned. I also know what happened when it went up to the Third Circuit. And at the end of the day, there are mechanics that you need to develop in order to develop an index. And it works in the antitrust world, and it doesn't work in this world. And I would hope that the Commission wouldn't go back in that kind of a direction again, and just go back and read what the Third Circuit had to say.
I would add, if you do intend to go that way, I think it's really important to take into account the fact that most people still get their local news and information from newspapers and television stations. And so to somehow account for the fact that a lot of us still don't even have access to the internet. So, and those of us who do aren't necessarily getting most of our news in that means. So I think it needs to account for, and I don't even know if this is really feasible, but it needs to account for, here are all the news sources, and here's the reality of how people are consuming those sources.
I'd come back to the basic principle that I had before, that you really do need to base it on facts. I don't think that any of us know exactly how the audiences really get their information. But I will also say, and this will sound terribly flip, but having been here during the time of the development of the diversity index, I'm with George. Don't go there.
I'm very pleased to agree with Jane and George.
Thank you. New York City is obviously very different from a small community. Should we distinguish? I know the current rules do distinguish based on size of geographic markets at this point. Is that appropriate? Should we do that more than we do today?
No. Again, what we're trying to do is look at the reality in the marketplace. And you've got a statute that tells you you're supposed to look at competition. And if you look at what is happening in the marketplaces, you will find that Google is taking advertising dollars out of small markets just like it's taking advertising dollars out of New York City. I can Google Richmond local news, and Google's going to scrape a lot of local news sources, and it's going to put up a lot of local advertising right next to it. There are real threats to the viability of local media platforms in small markets. It is easy to say, and the Commission has said it, oh, well, you know, there aren't so many voices in small markets, and so we have to draw a line at the top 20 or the top 5 or the top whatever. The answer is that the Commission needs to look at what the effect is of its ownership regulations in those marketplaces, and it needs to be very concerned when it sees stations going dark on news, or stations going away, or newspapers going away in small and middle-sized communities. Those are the ones that I see every day. It's a real issue. And to pretend that there aren't serious consequences from the way the industries have developed and the way the marketplaces have developed is just not serving the public, because the public needs to understand the information. It needs to understand its communities. It needs something that reflects its communities back to it. And if the local news sources go away because they're no longer economic, and that's what we're talking about, the Commission's really made a big mistake. And so I think that drawing a line that's artificial, that says, you know, it's convenient, we'll pick the top 20 markets, is a huge mistake.
I think that the Commission has drawn some reasonable guidelines in terms of how it treats different size markets. The Commission has waiver policies in place for distressed stations where the market rules are not applicable and are not functioning properly. I think right now that seems to be working, and I would not suggest that a change is needed.
I concur with George's remarks. I think that is an ineffective way to look at what the marketplace is and how it functions.
In any discussion of media, an elephant in the room is the Internet. And as we look at the sort of two-sided market that broadcasters exist in, the market for advertising and the market for the programming that you provide to your viewers or listeners, one possible interpretation of what the Internet has done is to suck away great value, some would say destroy value, by taking away advertising revenue, but not to provide as much an alternative source of at least some of the local programming that broadcasters provide. One thing that we need to try to look at, I think, is the degree to which the Internet has become an alternative source, original source of local news and public affairs of the kind that broadcasters have always brought to their viewers and listeners. I know that we're focusing on process today, but I'll go beyond process to substance since we have such knowledgeable people here. How do we gauge whether the Internet has become an independent source of local news and public affairs, and in your experience, has it?
Well, my experience, the Internet is largely an aggregation of news from other providers, and I see little, if any, original news creation and product creation, at least with respect to news, on the websites that we look at.
Yeah, I agree completely, Bill. The Internet sucks a lot of advertising dollars out of communities, but it doesn't provide new information to communities. By definition, it can't. Somebody sitting in California can't be reporting on the kinds of things that are going on in small communities in Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida. They don't have the feet on the ground. Your local broadcasters do have the feet on the ground, and your local newspapers have feet on the ground. And those are the only places that it's going to come from. So I mean, the only places it's going to come from that we would consider the sort of quality sites or quality sources. There are truly bloggers out there, and some people look to bloggers for information, but at the end of the day, the community, I think, needs a trusted source and a branded source, if you will, of information. And the Internet is not providing any of that. It is only sucking dollars out of communities.
I tend to agree with my co-panelist here that there's not a whole lot of local news, except for that which is aggregated from other sources on the Internet. I'd also like to point out that there are still a lot of communities, especially the poor and rural communities, who don't even have access. So this wouldn't be an alternative source of information at all, especially for many of our constituents.
I want to be sure that I distinguish between news and commentary. I think there's an abundance of original commentary for sure on the Internet, to George's point, and I don't diminish that in any way. I think that is a richness of content if one can sort through that. But just to clarify with respect to original creation of news product, I think it's largely aggregation driven.
I think we have a little bit of a definitional divide or something. Is that the right word? I think you have to focus on some of the things that the Internet is providing that I think are important as you're looking at your ownership rules, which is that it is a source of local information in terms of some of the community events and such things that are that can in fact be an important source on the Internet. It is a source of it is taking away the advertising dollars, as George has pointed out. I think it does have to be taken into account when you're looking at your ownership rules, because it is a factor in the competitive marketplace, and it is a source of opinion and the dialogue that is one of the things that you mentioned a few moments ago.
If one looked at the largest number of page views and visitors in a marketplace, the typical pattern is that either the leading local newspaper or the leading local TV station is the top-of-mind brand that generates the most traffic, but that traffic is still typically secondary to a Google audience or a Yahoo audience in terms of visits from that marketplace. And that, again, is driven by some of the out-of-market viewing and traffic to that site. But the strong media brands still are strong media brands on the different platform of the web.
I would concur with David and George that you're not seeing a lot of original news on the Internet. You're seeing a lot of advertising and aggregation of the local television and local newspapers, and a lot of blogging, which David's been very kind about its value, and I probably am not one who is so appreciative of blogging, but I think that in terms of what it means in terms of increasing news and information to the hard news to the public, I think it's been very limited.
It seems like there's a tension between, we want to count these as contributors, as new voices, all these new media sources in a market, and the fact that they are not necessarily equivalent to broadcast voices in terms of the character and quality of information that's provided to the market. And it seems to me it suggests some need for weighting that everybody seemed to not agree with. So I'm trying to figure out, as a process matter, it seems you want to take account of them in one context but not in another, and it seems to me that suggests a need to say, well, we have to say they exist, but they're not the same as having another broadcast station in the market. Is there some way to try and deal with that tension? I mean, I know the diversity index didn't work, but it was dealing with the concept of, some of these voices may have different contributions to make, and that we should account for that in some way or another.
I think you just get into a dangerous area if you're weighting and so valuing particular kinds of speech or particular outputs of speech. And I just don't think I understand your point. I don't think there's a workable way to do it that gets the commission on the right side of constitutional law.
To me, it's an acknowledgement that this information platform is there, but it is not trying to come up with a formula that weights it or creates a value assignment for it. It's an acknowledgement.
But I think you have to acknowledge it. And I think the question that Bill asked earlier about the connection with the democracy and the free exchange of ideas is something that you simply can't discount, the value of what's going on the Internet.
I guess we're left with the hard question of what we do after we acknowledge that it exists.
Well, but what you see is that there are a lot of different speakers in a community. And that's a huge change over where we were in, for example, 1975. And I think that's something that 202H language comes into effect. What's competition? What's happened in the market? What are the real circumstances on the ground? I think the Commission needs to acknowledge that the world today is a different world than it was back then.
And you ask yourself if in Baltimore we could own a second top 4 station, or if we could own the Baltimore Sun in addition to Baltimore Television, would it diminish the import of those other voices? And I will argue, no, it wouldn't.
Yeah, I guess the question is, are we concerned about the concentration of those quality sources of news as being offset by ones that don't have the same character or quality of information being provided to the community? And I agree that it's a horribly difficult thing to measure, and certainly we were unsuccessful in doing so the first time we tried. It just seems that if the Commission's objective is to produce a certain environment of information in a market based on those institutions it has some jurisdiction over, it can't ignore the value of the other competitors, because we could end up with the rules that eliminated all the broadcasters and you're left with 6 bloggers. That may not be the outcome you're looking for. So somehow or another you have to invent a matrix that lets you take account of their relative value and their existence as well.
And I think that's exactly the point, Bob. I mean, what it comes down to is that you need to have a healthy environment where broadcasters can continue to exist. You should not have a rule structure that eliminates or makes it so difficult for the broadcasters to provide the local news that you're essentially eliminating the goal that you had.
Our ownership rules have typically been written as bright line rules. In a particular market, you can't own X and Y. We also have an obligation in considering any particular merger transaction to consider whether, under all its circumstances, it's in the public interest. Should we move away from bright line rules and rely more on review of individual transactions in particular cases, or would that, among other things, deprive the industry of the certainty that it would prefer to have?
I think you have to have some sort of basic rules to shoot at, but basically as a legal matter, you have to be able to consider all of the circumstances. I think that the case law is pretty clear that if someone comes in and makes a compelling case that they should have a waiver, that the Commission has to consider that. So bright line rules have never really been totally bright, but they do give a good structure for the industry to know, okay, this is the essential parameters that we have to work with.
I would second the preference for bright line rules, and also just add that I think we already have some flexibility in the process through the waiver provisions.
With the risk of belaboring the comments and the suggestions that we made, I think that is an approach that gives some presumptive understanding of what can occur, subject to additional review as appropriate.
Yeah, I agree.
I would support bright line rules, and I would note that the commission has granted probably far too many waivers of the multiple ownership rules in recent history, such that some of the bright lines have been blurred to non-existence. So I would urge a refocusing on those bright lines.
Okay, I think I've really enjoyed asking you these questions and hearing your thoughts. And what I'd like to do now is to just give each of you an opportunity to give us any sort of closing thoughts you may have on the process we're engaged in, how we can make sure that this process is as successful as it can be, and on sort of any closing thoughts on any of the issues we've discussed today. I'll start with you, David.
Gather my thoughts here. I think this has been a very fascinating discussion. I think, speaking for myself, I've had the opportunity to express some points of view that I think would enable a better policy-making regimen here for the industry. And, I hope the Commission moves expeditiously here and takes into account today's media landscape and the media future that we are rushing into here as it develops new rules and regulations for us. And I think the local system that we have is a wonderfully beneficial system for citizens of this country, and I hope the Commission ultimately comes to some helpful determinations about rules that will preserve our system of local broadcasting in this country and enable us to build on the strengths that we have.
I'm really glad that we've been having these hearings this week, and this discussion about process, I think, is really important, and I thank you for allowing NHMC to come and present to you on how this issue affects our community.
I too want to say I think it's a very good thing to have the workshops that you've had this week. I think it's an essential way of gathering information and preparing for the onslaught that you're about to face. We salute you. But also wanted to make clear that I think that it's very important for the Commission to keep its eye on the ball in terms of what's the ultimate goal. And I think we've done some talking about that today. We need to have rules that facilitate the continuation of the kind of local service that American people rely on.
I really commend you for getting this proceeding underway this way. I'm really happy that before we've gotten to 2010, the Commission's looking at its quadrennial procedures. And I would hope that the 2010 procedures are not going to take more than 2010, and we're not going to be doing this in 2011 and 2012, which has been the history, unfortunately, in these proceedings. I think that when you go out and you look at the real world, you'll see a lot more of what we talked about today, and that is that market conditions have changed. There's a lot more competition for eyeballs. There's a lot more competition for ad dollars. That has had real impacts on the industries that you're talking about here, and those changes need to be reflected in the Commission's ownership rules. I think it's important in the keeping your eye on the ball kind of a phrase and concept that the Commission not turn an ownership proceeding into some kind of a Christmas tree that it hangs lots and lots of different kinds of ornaments off of. That is a certain way to bog it down. But the Commission has a statutory mandate here, and it needs to work with that mandate. And it needs to move as quickly as possible. And if there's any question about why that's important, I'd only ask you to go look at some of the things that I've written about in my prepared comments and some of the things that you've heard about today. With so many people in this industry in bankruptcy right now, this is not just an academic exercise. This is real world stuff. And these industries have been waiting for a long time for the Commission to get its rules straight. And so I would encourage you to remember what's going on outside this building and in the small markets and the medium-sized markets where I am, as well as in the large markets. We've heard about Boston, but Philadelphia, look at what's going on in Chicago. There are huge changes going on in this industry, and the Commission needs to remember that.
I concur with my fellow panelists in thanking you for convening this workshop. It's been a pleasure to participate. I think we've had a good back and forth. Hopefully you've gotten some good feedback from us. I do think that it could be possible to get too many issues on the table, but I think that the Commission needs to be looking at many issues in this proceeding and decide either to address them here or in other settings. In particular, I think the one of minority ownership is one that needs to be on the table here. The demise of many minority owners over the past decade is directly related to changes in the Commission's ownership rules. Most of those changes were imposed upon the Commission by Congress, I recognize that, but I think that any further modification of those rules needs to consider the impact on minority ownership. And I look forward to helping you flesh out those issues in this proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. This has been very helpful and thought-provoking, and very much appreciate all of your being here. Thank you, and we're adjourned.